When people talk about power, they often mean tanks, aircraft carriers, satellites, or economic dominance. But let me ask you something deeper. What happens when those things collapse? What happens when empires fall, currencies vanish, and borders are redrawn? Most of them disappear into the footnotes of history. But India doesn't disappear. It adapts. It absorbs. And then it rises again. Not once, not twice, but every time. You can't defeat what refuses to die. India is not just a country. It is a civilization. A continuous thread of thought, language, science, spirituality, and struggle that stretches back over 5,000 years. That's not a poetic exaggeration. That's a historical reality. You can trace India's intellectual and cultural DNA across time. From the Vedic chants to the Upanishads, from Chanakya's Arthashastra to Aryabhata's astronomy. From the spiritual revolutions of the Buddha to the breakthroughs of modern Indian scientists. That continuity, that unbroken line of identity is India's true armor. Not missiles, not money, but memory. That's why India survives colonization, invasions, plunder, and manipulation, because India doesn't just operate on the material level. It lives on a deeper psychological and philosophical plane. It operates from dharma, from a sense of inner order and meaning that doesn't collapse even when outer systems are destroyed. You can rule Indian land, but you cannot colonize the Indian spirit. Even when it was politically conquered, look at history. The Mughals came to rule. India absorbed them. They became part of its music, its food, even its language. The British came to extract. But India transformed their imposition into a launch pad for intellectual rebellion. Gandhi didn't win with violence. He didn't win with weapons. He won with ideas, with truth, with non-violence, with an ancient spiritual principle that modern minds still struggle to comprehend. That is not just resistance, that is psychological dominance. This is why the West, despite all its power, can't truly defeat India. Because it's not fighting a country, it's facing an idea. And ideas don't die when borders are breached. Ideas don't crumble when GDP dips or markets fall. Ideas are like seeds. You bury them and they grow back stronger. Even today, this legacy plays out in ways most people don't consciously notice, and India doesn't need to shout to prove itself. There's a quiet self-assurance in the Indian psyche, a deep knowing that it has already seen the rise and fall of so many superpowers. Rome, gone. Persia, gone. Colonial empires, gone. But India is still here, not as a relic, as a rising force. And what's remarkable is that India does this not by copying the West, but by blending ancient wisdom with modern innovation. We often speak of resilience, but India redefines it. Resilience is not just about surviving pain, it's about extracting purpose from it. Every crisis India has faced, partition, poverty, famine, foreign rule, it has turned into fuel for reinvention. It's as if every time someone tries to break India, it becomes a forge that strengthens it instead. This also explains why the Indian mind is so hard to predict. It's wired to hold contradictions, to navigate complexity, to operate without needing black and white answers. This is a civilization that understood quantum-like thinking before quantum physics had a name. Think about the Bhagavad Gita. It's a text that embraces paradox, action through inaction, detachment through duty, surrender through self-mastery. That kind of depth is what gives India not just its spiritual strength, but also its psychological flexibility. In a chaotic world, India doesn't break. It bends. It flows. It adapts. And in that lies the ultimate strength. Adaptability, powered by identity. The West often tries to define nations through economic indicators or military spending. But India defines itself through something deeper. A sense of purpose that has evolved over millennia. And this purpose is not domination, It is self-realization. India doesn't want to rule others, it wants to realize itself fully. And in doing so, it shakes the very foundations of Western assumptions about power. So, when someone asks why India can't be defeated by the West, the answer is simple. You can't defeat what doesn't play your game. India isn't trying to win the world, it's trying to understand it, to shape it, to serve it, in ways that are far more enduring than military campaigns or economic sanctions. Power comes and goes, but meaning stays. And in the end, the one who cannot be defeated is the one who has already made peace with struggle. India is that one. Let me tell you something people often overlook. Real power today isn't held by the one with the most weapons or even the most money. It's held by the one with the most intelligence. And not just academic intelligence. I'm talking about adaptability, pattern recognition, cross-disciplinary thinking, the ability to solve problems that haven't even been imagined yet. Now ask yourself, which country, generation after generation, produces this kind of mind? India. You go to any major global tech company, Google, Microsoft, IBM, Adobe, and what do you see? An Indian running it. That's not luck. That's not coincidence. That's not diversity quota. That's intellectual dominance, built through centuries of cultivating the mind as a tool of transformation. See, Indian education didn't start with textbooks. It started with introspection, with asking the big questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What is truth? This ancient philosophical inquiry gave rise to an intellectual culture rooted in self-awareness and critical thinking. It wasn't just about memorizing facts. It was about learning how to think, how to debate, how to imagine, how to interpret reality from multiple angles. This is why Indian minds today excel at what the modern world demands: mental flexibility. We're in an era where the future belongs to those who can learn fast, unlearn faster, and collaborate across boundaries. Indian talent thrives under those conditions. You can put an Indian in a lab, in a startup, in a space agency, in a boardroom, and they will find a way to adapt and perform. That isn't just hard work. That's cognitive agility. And let's be honest, the West knows it. Why else are H-1B visas so hotly debated? Why do top universities prioritize Indian students? Why does Silicon Valley quietly depend on AIT graduates, Indian engineers and coders who power everything from AI to blockchain? Because the West is running on Indian brainpower. The infrastructure of their future is being quietly built by minds trained in humility, in discipline, in scarcity, and in resilience. But here's what makes it even more interesting. This intelligence isn't arrogant. Indian intellect is often deeply self-effacing. It's not loud, it's not showy, it's curious, it observes, it adapts. And that humility allows it to work under pressure, to evolve without ego, and to thrive in chaos. That's rare, and that's powerful. Think about it. Indian kids grow up speaking 2, 3, sometimes 4 languages. They learn to switch between value systems, home and school, tradition and technology, English and mother tongue, effortlessly. That's not confusion. That's multi-layered intelligence being developed from an early age. It's a mind being trained to exist in complexity without getting overwhelmed by it. The psychological depth here is important. A mind that has grown up balancing contradictions is a mind that can innovate in uncertain environments. The world today is unpredictable. Things are shifting faster than our institutions can keep up. But an Indian mind trained in navigating contradiction doesn't freeze in uncertainty, it flows with it. And this is also why the West struggles to defeat India. You can't outthink a people who have made thinking a cultural legacy. You can't outsmart a civilization that has seen the rise and fall of every ideological system on Earth, and still continues to generate leaders, inventors, visionaries, and creators. It's not just about intelligence. It's about sustainable intelligence. Intelligence that grows stronger under adversity. That's what Indian talent represents. When a student studies for 14 hours a day to crack an exam with a 1% acceptance rate, when a small-town coder builds an AI tool used by millions globally, when a doctor from a village hospital ends up leading a World Health Initiative, that's more than brilliance. That's a mindset. That's fire in the soul. And the West, for all its universities and wealth, can't replicate that mindset because it wasn't born out of comfort. It was born out of struggle, out of centuries of colonization, chaos, and conflict. The Indian mind knows what it's like to be underestimated. And that's what makes it lethal, because it never stops learning, never stops proving, never stops rising. If you're listening to this and you're from India or have Indian roots, understand what you carry inside you. You are not just competing, you are representing a lineage of genius, of grit, of generations who believed in the power of the mind above all. Don't waste that. And if you're watching from outside, understand this. You can hire Indian talent, you can collaborate with it, you can even try to contain it, but you can't defeat it. Because in a world ruled by intelligence, the country that shaped the mind will always shape the future. You know, when we talk about power in today's world, we usually imagine countries choosing sides, East versus West, democracy versus authoritarianism, old alliances versus emerging blocs. But India doesn't play that game. It watches it, studies it, and then chooses its own move, always on its own terms. That's what sets India apart, and that's exactly why the West can't defeat it. India's strength lies in its ability to remain neutral without becoming irrelevant. That's not easy. Most countries get swallowed into someone else's agenda by fear, pressure, or the lure of resources. But India, despite being courted by both sides, has mastered the rare skill of strategic autonomy. It chooses collaboration over alignment. It prefers dialogue over dependency. And in doing so, it creates a position of influence that can't be coerced. This is psychological power. The power to say no without being isolated and yes without becoming submissive. It's not a new trait either. India has been doing this for centuries, whether it was dealing with Mongol invasions, British diplomacy, Soviet alignment, or American courtship. India has always maintained a clear idea of who it is and where its interests lie. Even during the Cold War, when most of the world picked a side, India led the non-aligned movement, not out of indecision, but out of principle. That principle was simple. We don't let others define our destiny. In today's global chessboard, this approach is even more powerful. Think about it. India is a member of BRICS with Russia and China. It's also a key partner in the Quad alongside the US, Japan, and Australia. It buys oil from Iran, signs defense deals with France, collaborates on AI with the US, and maintains diplomatic dialogue with Palestine and Israel simultaneously. That's not confusion. That's strategic balance at the highest level. It's India saying we will engage with everyone, but we will not be used by anyone. And the West struggles with that, because the West is used to loyalty being transactional. If I invest in you, you owe me. But India doesn't operate from fear or need. It operates from clarity of purpose. That's a deeply philosophical stance, one rooted in its ancient traditions of detachment and self-mastery. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna tells Arjuna to act without attachment to the outcome. That's not just spiritual advice, it's geopolitical wisdom. India engages in global partnerships, but it's not attached to external validation. It does what aligns with its dharma, its duty, not someone else's agenda. This level of clarity makes India unpredictable to the West. And in geopolitics, unpredictability is power. Because if your opponent can't predict your next move, they can't control you. And if they can't control you, they have to respect you. Let's take a recent example. When the West sanctioned Russia, it expected India to follow suit. But India didn't, not because it supports war, but because it understands its own interests: energy security, strategic balance, regional stability. It bought Russian oil, not out of rebellion, but out of rational self-interest, and at the same time it continued its defense collaboration with the US and increased its investments in Europe. That's not contradiction. That's multidimensional statecraft. It's India refusing to be reduced to a proxy. This autonomy is a quiet kind of strength. It's not dramatic, it's not loud, but it's incredibly difficult to defeat. Because how do you break something that refuses to cling to rigid alliances? How do you isolate a nation that builds bridges with everyone? How do you intimidate a country that doesn't need to be told who its enemies are? The answer is, you don't. You can't. This is what makes India one of the few countries in the world that can sit at any table with China, with the US, with Africa, with Latin America, and speak with credibility. Because it isn't pretending. It's not being manipulated. It's standing on the strength of its own decisions. And here's the deeper psychological insight. India has learned through centuries of conflict and colonization that true independence isn't about rejecting power. It's about knowing when and how to engage with it. That's wisdom born from pain. It's the mindset of a nation that doesn't seek domination, but refuses to be dominated. So while the West may try to frame global politics as a binary, you're either with us or against us, India stands firm in its third path. We are with ourselves. And that position, more than any alliance or weapon, is what makes India unshakable. Let me ask you something. What's more impressive? Building something great with unlimited resources, or creating greatness in the face of scarcity? Because if you really want to understand why India can't be defeated, you need to look at its economic journey. Not just the numbers, but the mindset behind the numbers. It's one of the most underestimated success stories of the modern world. There was a time, not long ago, when India was mocked as the country that couldn't feed itself. It had to import food, accept aid, take loans, and endure global humiliation. People called it the third world, as if it was destined to be stuck behind forever. But what the world didn't realize is that India doesn't just survive, it adapts, it transforms, and it grows from the inside out. India went from being a country dependent on weak donations to launching the world's most cost-efficient Mars mission. And that is not a statistic, that's a statement. A statement about priorities, about frugality, about intelligence under pressure. That Mars mission costs less than some Hollywood movies. Think about that. In a world obsessed with luxury budgets, India delivered performance with purpose. That's not just good economics, that's economic philosophy. India's philosophy has always been about making the most out of the least. That's the root of Jugaad, the uniquely Indian concept of innovative problem solving. It's not about perfection, it's about effectiveness. Can we make it work? Can we get results with what we have? And again, this isn't weakness. This is economic resilience powered by ingenuity. The West often believes power comes from having more capital, more machines, more imports. But India shows that power also comes from needing less and still achieving more. That's a very different game, one that the West doesn't know how to play, and definitely one it doesn't know how to win. Look at the digital revolution happening in India right now. While the West debates privacy laws and big tech monopolies, India created the world's largest biometric digital identity system, Aadhaar, and connected over 1 billion people in record time. It's now leading in real-time digital payments, UPI transactions, and mobile banking. This isn't a rich country doing rich country things. This is a developing country leapfrogging the West by building smart, lean, scalable infrastructure that directly serves its people. And it's not just digital. Look at manufacturing. India didn't rely on a single model. It understood that true self-reliance, Atmanirbharta, doesn't mean isolation. It means building an ecosystem of capabilities across sectors where India becomes both a consumer market and a production engine. That's why global companies are moving supply chains to India, not because they're doing India a favor, but because they've realized India is the only large-scale democracy that can deliver long-term stability with growth. Now here's where the psychological depth comes in. This kind of transformation isn't just about GDP growth or industrial policy. It's about shifting identity. For decades, India saw itself through the lens of being behind. Behind the West, behind China, behind expectations. But slowly, through action, it has started to see itself as a creator, not just a consumer. A producer of technology, a shaper of markets, a builder of infrastructure. That shift is everything. Because once a country believes in its ability to create, you can't intimidate it with what you already have. India no longer needs to copy anyone's development model. It's building its own, one rooted in inclusion, digital empowerment, decentralized infrastructure, and massive scale. 1 billion people with access to digital identity, digital finance, and digital opportunity. That is economic force at a level the West never anticipated. And the world is slowly waking up to this. The IMF, the World Bank, the CEOs in New York and Davos, they all now understand India is not a market to extract from. It's a market that creates value, exports talent, and drives innovation. You can't afford to ignore it, but more importantly, you can't control it. That's the part that unsettles many in the West. Because India isn't rising by taking handouts. It's rising by standing on its own legs. And when you build strength from within, when your foundation is your own people, your own systems, your own ideas, you become unshakable. You might bend under pressure. You might slow down in crisis, but you don't break. You rebuild. And that's why India cannot be defeated economically. Because it's not chasing dominance, it's chasing dignity. And that pursuit makes it immune to dependency. There's a kind of power that's loud, that demands attention, shows of force, military parades, shock and awe campaigns. And then there's another kind of power, the kind that remains quiet, disciplined, steady, but when tested, it strikes with precision and purpose. That's the power India holds. And that's exactly why it can't be defeated. Most people misunderstand India's approach to military strength. They think because India rarely starts conflict, it must be soft. But that's a mistake many empires have made before. India doesn't show its strength the way others do. It doesn't need to. It is peaceful, but not powerless. That is a position of extreme psychological clarity. Let's be clear. India is a nuclear-armed nation. It has one of the world's largest standing armies. Its navy is growing rapidly. Its air force is modernizing with both indigenous and international technology, but more importantly, it has moral restraint. And that's rare. Because having power and choosing when not to use it, that's real strength. You don't need to prove what you already know about yourself. India's defense posture is rooted in the principle of non-aggression, but not naivete. It's a calculated, deeply philosophical stance, and it comes from a long history, one where India has always viewed war as a last resort, never a first move. But when pushed, when provoked, when its sovereignty is threatened, it responds with clarity, not chaos. This restraint isn't a weakness, it's psychological maturity. Because India understands something most powers forget. Winning a war isn't the same as winning peace. India isn't interested in dominance, it's interested in stability. And that makes it even more dangerous to those who seek to control or provoke it. Because you can't bait a country that thinks before it reacts. You can't manipulate a nation that doesn't fight to impress. You can't defeat a mindset that sees war not as a game but as a sacred responsibility. That's what's often missing in Western analysis of India's military. They count the missiles, the jets, the troops, but they don't count the psychology. And in warfare, psychology wins before weapons do. Take a look at India's history with its neighbors. It has fought multiple wars, but it has never been the aggressor. Every time India went to battle, it was because someone else crossed the line, And every time, India responded with precision, not rage. There's a kind of silent confidence in that. Not the confidence of a bully, but of a protector. India's military strength isn't there to conquer. It's there to guard civilization. A civilization that understands the cost of war because it has lived through thousands of years of both peace and conflict. Now, here's what makes this even more fascinating. While India continues to strengthen its military, it's also investing in homegrown defense innovation, not to show off, but to secure self-reliance that matters. Because when your defense is built on your own terms, your own systems, your own research, you don't become dependent on others when things go wrong. You stand firm. You hold the line. India's defense isn't just about tanks and warplanes. It's about philosophy meeting strategy. That's why doctrines like no first use in nuclear policy carry so much weight, because it signals to the world we have the capacity, we have the capability, but we also have the character not to misuse it. In an era where military threats are often used like poker chips, India's moral discipline is a power move, because it shows it's not insecure, it doesn't need to flex, it just needs to be ready. And it is ready. The psychological message India sends to its adversaries is clear. We don't seek war, but we don't fear it either. And that mindset is rooted not just in strategy, but in culture. Think about the Mahabharata, India's epic that centers on a war. The message isn't go to war. The message is fight only when there's no other option. And even then, fight with clarity, not hate. That kind of wisdom shapes a nation's soul. It teaches generations that courage isn't about aggression. It's about knowing when to hold back and when to step forward with conviction. So when the West looks at India and wonders why it doesn't react the way others do, it's missing the deeper truth. India is not reactive. It is deliberate. And that makes it extremely difficult to destabilize or defeat, because a country that isn't addicted to violence but is always prepared for it, that country cannot be conquered, only respected. In the end, the most powerful nations are not those that seek to destroy, but those that choose when and how to protect, with strength in hand and wisdom in heart. That is India. Let me share something most people in the West still don't fully understand. They look at India's democracy and they see disorder, too many languages, too many opinions, too many religions, castes, cultures, conflicts. From the outside, it looks noisy, even chaotic. But what they call chaos, India calls coexistence. And that's not just poetic language. That's psychological resilience on a national scale. You see, many countries have tried to copy democracy. Very few have made it thrive. Even fewer have kept it intact while carrying the weight of 1 billion people, dozens of religions, and hundreds of ethnic groups. India didn't just adopt democracy, it bent it, stretched it, transformed it to fit its own ancient traditions of debate, dialogue, and diversity. That's what makes India unique. Not the vote, but the voice behind the vote. This is the only country in the world where you can have a Hindu prime minister, a Sikh president, a Muslim vice president, and a Christian speaker of parliament, and nobody burns the country down. The idea that these identities can exist within one framework, under one constitution, sharing one future, that is a miracle the world doesn't talk enough about. Why? Because it proves something deeply uncomfortable for the West, that you don't need to be uniform to be united. The West historically built strength through similarity. Same language, same race, same religion, same ideology. But India built its strength by learning how to hold contradictions together. And that's not just politics, that's deep psychological training. Imagine growing up switching between 3 languages before lunch. Imagine understanding that your neighbor may worship a different god, eat different food, follow different customs, and still be part of the same nation. That kind of mental flexibility doesn't just create tolerance, it creates intellectual complexity. And here's what makes it powerful. This diversity doesn't weaken India, it inoculates it. It gives it layers of defense. When one part of the system faces tension, the other parts absorb the shock. The center holds. It's like a decentralized network. You can't take it down from one angle. That's why colonialism couldn't kill it. That's why terrorism hasn't broken it. That's why misinformation, polarization, and even global media bias haven't destroyed it. India's strength comes from the fact that it has already survived everything the West fears most: religious violence, linguistic divisions, mass poverty, even emergency rule. And yet it still remains. Not perfect, but intact. Still evolving, still moving forward. What country on earth can claim that kind of democratic endurance under this much complexity? And I'll say something even stronger. If democracy can work in India, with its scale, its history, its poverty, its complexity, then it can work anywhere. India is not the exception. India is the proof. Now think about this from a global power perspective. The West can't defeat India because it doesn't know how to deal with this level of unpredictable resilience. You can sanction a dictatorship, you can destabilize a monarchy. But how do you control 1 billion people with 1,000 opinions and still one direction? That's not control, that's alignment. That's not enforced unity, that's earned trust. And it scares the systems that rely on suppression to survive. And make no mistake, India has its challenges, deep ones. But that's the point. It fights those challenges within a democratic framework, not outside of it. Every election is a reminder to the world the people of India are still choosing, still speaking, still believing in the idea of a nation built on voice, not violence. That's not weakness, that's an act of courage. Repeat it over and over again. And here's the deeper psychological truth. India's diversity teaches its people one of the rarest skills in today's polarized world: the ability to live with difference without needing to destroy it. That mindset is what the future needs. Not uniformity, but unity in difference. Not control, but collaboration. And India has been practicing that for thousands of years, long before it became fashionable in boardrooms and academic papers. So when people ask why India can't be defeated, the answer isn't just about its army or economy. It's about its mindset. A mindset trained in flexibility, forged in difference, and rooted in the belief that democracy doesn't mean sameness. It means space for everyone, even when it's messy, especially when it's messy. Because in the end, the nation that learns to hold many voices without losing its soul, that nation doesn't fall, it evolves. And that nation is India.